This is the first session in a series of classes on world religions, an elective for the theology program. My name is Rob Bowman. I'll be your instructor for the next 8 weeks. We're going to be talking about the four major world religions other than Christianity that are of most significance in Western culture, North America, Europe, etc. And those four religions are Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Of course, I'm not suggesting by any means that these are the only significant religions other than Christianity, or that these are the only ones that people should know about, but these would, by any measure, I think, be the big four for our purposes. And one of them, actually, all out of proportion to the number of people that associate with this religion, and that's the one that we're going to be starting off with, which is the religion known as Judaism. Now, let me just say something before I get into tonight's subject of Judaism, and that is throughout this course, I'm going to be looking at these religions as somebody who has an interest in them from the perspective of evangelical Christianity, how we look at these religions from a biblical Christian perspective. My plan, my method throughout this course and the schedule that I'm going to try to follow is we're going to have 2 weeks on each of these four religions, and that will be 8 weeks altogether. The first week out of each 2-week sequence will be a quick overview of that religion, looking at the origins and historical development and most significant features that people need to know about for that religion, their basic beliefs, ideas, and the major groups or divisions of each of these religions so that people will know something about the big picture with regards to these religions. And then the second week out of each 2-week sequence, we'll get into some more depth, look at what these religions say in contradiction to evangelical Christianity, look at some of the issues that come up when one discusses matters of faith with people in these religions, talk a little bit about perhaps some things that we need to be aware of in order to share our faith effectively and sensitively with people in these religions. So that's the basic plan, and you'll see that illustrated by the way that we discuss Judaism this week and next week. So without further ado, let me jump into the subject of Judaism. I have 4,000 years to cover in about an hour, so that's a daunting task. Judaism traces its history classically back to Abraham. In fact, the three major monotheistic religions in the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all regard Abraham as, in some sense, the father of the faith. Traditionally, Abraham is credited with being or recognized as having been the first monotheist. That is, after most of the world had gone polytheistic or animistic or in some other way lost the knowledge of the Creator God that we as Christians and Jews also believe Adam and Eve had when they were first created. Once you get down to the time of Abraham, the world from one side of the globe to the other is mired in polytheism and other religious belief systems, worldviews that are completely alien to belief in one all-powerful, eternal Creator God. And Abraham is widely regarded by Jews as well as by Christians and Muslims as the first man in that cultural context to understand that there was only one God, and that this God was distinct from all of creation. And that is basically what monotheism says, that there is one eternal creator God that is distinct from the world and everything in it, and that runs the world, who is the sovereign Lord, King of creation. And of course, all three of these religions believe that Abraham, in some sense, had this revealed to him, although there are traditions about Abraham having figured it out to some extent. Nevertheless, the general belief, and certainly what Genesis says, is that God revealed himself to Abraham and gave him some knowledge about him. Now, Abraham also is regarded in Judaism, according to the book of Genesis, as the individual with whom starts the mark of the covenant people, the mark of the Jewish people, known as circumcision. Circumcision is something that other cultures from time to time have practiced, but in most of the history of the Jewish people, their practice of circumcision has been regarded with some disdain or even disgust by other people. At times, it has been forbidden by law, and specifically that being aimed specifically at the Jewish people from time to time. But it goes back to Abraham, according to Genesis chapter 17. Now, Abraham's grandson was named Jacob. And Jacob, according to Genesis, was renamed Israel. And Israel then is the name of a man, also known as Jacob. And it's also the name of a people or a nation, an ethnic community, an ethnic group of people who regard themselves all as descendants of or children of Jacob. And they are often simply called Israelites when we're talking about the Old Testament era in particular. Now, I think it would be helpful to get some sense of the timing of these things, so let me just, I'm going to use some very approximate dates in most cases. There's only one or two dates that I'm going to throw at you that are precise dates because we're pretty sure about these dates, and historians widely cite these particular dates as being turning points in the history of the Jewish people. But most of the dates I'm going to throw at you are just to give you kind of a grid of history for the last 4,000 years, so that you can kind of get a sense of the flow of these things. Abraham would be about 4,000 years ago, about 2,000 years before Christ. Now we're going to jump forward about 500 years, and again, this is very rough, so don't pin me down on the exact dates here in most cases, but if you go forward about 500 years to around 1500 BC, you're coming to the time of Moses. Moses, of course, is the famous deliverer of Israel from bondage in Egypt. The Israelites had found themselves enslaved in Egypt, and God leads them out of Egypt through a human deliverer named Moses. This is an event known, of course, as the Exodus. And it's recounted in the narrative book called the Book of Exodus. Now, the first and perhaps still most important holy day or festival in Jewish religion commemorates a crucial element of the Exodus story, which is known as Passover. Passover always falls at the second half of March, or the first half of April, and it commemorates the Israelites having been spared from the 10th and final climactic plague that came on the Egyptians, that forced Pharaoh to let them leave Egypt and escape out into the wilderness. That 10th plague was a plague of death upon the firstborn sons in every Egyptian household. And this plague did not come on the Jewish households, all of which had blood splattered on the doorway as a sign that the angel of death should pass by or pass over that particular doorway and go on to an Egyptian house to bring that plague, and so hence the term Passover. Every year, Jews celebrate the Exodus in the Passover meal known as the Seder, S-E-D-E-R is how you would spell that in English, Seder. And the Seder features, among other elements, the eating of unleavened bread, which is known as matzah. The reason why they eat unleavened bread is the same reason why they had it on the night of the Passover, the night that they got ready to leave Egypt. They were told to fix the bread without leaven because it would be faster, because they had to be ready to leave in a hurry. And so Jews to this day eat unleavened bread at Passover to remember when they had to leave Egypt in a hurry, presumably before the Pharaoh decided to change his mind. And of course, we all know the Pharaoh did change his mind and chased after the Israelites after they'd gotten a head start. That turned out to be a big mistake because Pharaoh and his army drowned in the Red Sea, as you probably all know that story. Well, the Israelites escaped into the wilderness, and Moses led them to a mountain known as Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, God gave them the beginnings of the Torah. We would spell that in English T-O-R-A-H, Torah. The Torah, which that word is traditionally translated law, the Torah is God's revelation of his covenant pact, his covenant agreement with the Israelites after they left the land of Egypt and before they went into their promised land. A covenant is basically a binding contract, particularly a contract between two nations or two powers. In this case, it's a contract between God and the nation of Israel. The centerpiece of this covenant, this Torah, is the Ten Commandments. And of course, the Ten Commandments have been of enormous influence and importance in Western culture, in Judaism and in Christianity for the last 3,500 years. Now, the Torah is a term that also refers in Jewish usage to the first 5 books of Moses. They are also known as the Torah, or the law. And the Torah includes the narrative of Genesis and how the Israelites got into Egypt in the first place, the book of Exodus, which tells how they got out, and the other 3 books tell about their adventures in the wilderness and the repetition or restatement of the law and the rededication of Israel to follow the law of God, the Torah, before they entered the promised land. In this Torah, there are instituted other holy days that the Jews were required to observe every year. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but 2 of them must be mentioned. The first is Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the New Year. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, head of the days, and it is the Jewish New Year. That always falls the last part of September or the early part of October on our calendar. And it is a day of celebration and very much like what we think of as the New Year. The other holy day that must be noted takes place 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, and that is Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippur, depending on how you like to say it. Yom Kippur means Day of Atonement, and is the most solemn holy day in Jewish religion. It is a day, classically in the Old Testament, when the high priest would go into the inner sanctuary, either of the tabernacle or later on in the temple, the innermost sanctuary, and he would offer a sacrifice of atonement for the entire nation of Israel. And only the high priest could enter into this Holy of Holies, which is the Hebrew way of saying holiest place. Only the high priest could go in there, only one day a year, on Yom Kippur. And he would offer this sacrifice as an atonement for the sins of all the people of Israel. Now, after the temple was destroyed, Jews continued to observe Yom Kippur, but they stopped offering animal sacrifices on Yom Kippur, and because they didn't have any place to do it. So the Day of Atonement has a different cachet, if you will, in modern Judaism than it did in ancient Judaism, but the basic meaning is supposed to be still the same. All right, a lot more obviously could be said about Moses and the Torah, but we're going to continue our romp through Jewish history and jump forward another half millennium, another 500 years roughly, to about 1000 BC. All right, so if you're trying to follow along here, I'm already going 1,000 years past Abraham. We had Abraham about 2000 BC, Moses roughly 1500 BC, and now roughly 1000 BC, David and Solomon. David, of course, was the first king of Israel to establish Jerusalem as the capital city. He wasn't the first Israelite king. That was Saul. But David is the most glorious, heroic figure in all of Israel's history. And he was the warrior king who established Jerusalem as the capital and the political, military, and spiritual center of Judaism. David was the primary author traditionally of the Psalms, not all of the Psalms, but an awful lot of them. And I certainly don't think there's any reason to doubt that David wrote a lot of the Psalms. David was, in a sense, during his own day, the spiritual leader of his people, even though he was not a priest or a prophet per se. In terms of his office, David, in terms of his life, embodied some aspects of all of those positions, as well as, of course, being, in terms of his office, the king of Israel. Well, David had a son named Solomon, and obviously I'm skipping a lot of interesting tidbits and bits of information to get the big picture. David's son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. It was a glorious building. Unfortunately, he had to tax the people heavily in order to make the temple project go forward, and that taxation, which fell heavily on everybody, but perhaps, I don't know, perhaps disproportionately on the northern tribes, at least they may have felt that way, was one of the issues that led to an unfortunate occurrence after Solomon's death, which was the breakup of Solomon's kingdom, of David and Solomon's kingdom of Israel, into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah. Of course, David was of the tribe of Judah, and Jerusalem was at the very northern edge of Judah's territory, strategically located at the edge between the northern and southern kingdom. The southern kingdom, which consisted of Judah, the little tribe of Benjamin for at least most of the remaining history, was the southern kingdom, and then the other 10 tribes, for the most part, constituted the northern kingdom. You've probably heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, the reason why they are known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel is that in 722 BC, don't worry about remembering that date, but in 722 BC, a military power to the east of them from Mesopotamia, known as the Assyrians, conquered the northern kingdom and scattered its people, and who knows what happened to those people. It's something of a mystery. Some of them ended up back in Judah, some of them intermarried with other people, some of them just melted into the surrounding culture and were never heard of again. There were prophets that came along to warn the people of the northern kingdom that this was going to happen to them. The people didn't listen. And they were, by the way, the reason why they were conquered, according to these prophets, wasn't because so much that they had split from the southern kingdom, although that was a problem, but because they were practicing idolatry, and the kings in the northern kingdom were tolerating and even participating in immoral behaviors, theft of property and other kinds of behaviors, along with their idolatry. Well, the southern kingdom didn't have too long to snicker over the fate of the northern kingdom, because in 586 BC, the southern kingdom was conquered by another Mesopotamian power that had displaced the Assyrians. These were the Babylonians. In 586 BC, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple. This was about the worst thing that they could imagine ever happening to them. It is one of the two greatest crises in the history of Judaism, certainly one of the three greatest, and arguably one of the greatest, the two greatest. Up to that point, the southern kingdom, like the northern kingdom, had continued to flirt with other gods, with worshiping idols, and with other kinds of forbidden behavior, even burning children on altars to false gods. I mean, that's how bad it was. But after the exile, when the Jews, term Jew basically means somebody from Judah. It means Judean or Judahite. When the Jews were conquered by the Babylonians, and many of them were carted off to Babylon, this was known as the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile really purged the Jewish people of polytheism and idolatry. You see almost nothing of polytheism or idolatry after the exile is over. After the Jews start returning to their land and rebuilding, they are a chastened people, and they are strictly monotheistic, with very little in the way of exceptions from this point on. And idolatry, forget about it. They're not going to do that. Again, obviously you might have an exceptional individual here or there doing something they're not supposed to do, but basically it came to a screeching halt after the exile. The Jews that survived the exile and rebuilt were a monotheistic people. Now, again, throughout all this period of the two kingdoms being warned by prophets and then conquered by the Mesopotamian powers, you do have these prophets coming along, and their writings are preserved for us in the Jewish Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, along with other writings. And of course I've mentioned the Psalms and the Torah and so forth. And if you just take the Torah, the Psalms, and the books of the prophets, you've got most of the Old Testament, not quite all, but you certainly got a lot of it. Now, the Jews are restored to the land by the Persians, and the Jews rebuild the temple, and we're now down to roughly, and again I stress roughly, 500 BC. So we've Abraham 2000 BC, Moses about 1500 BC, David and Solomon roughly 1000 BC, and now the rebuilding of the temple after the Jews are restored to the land, roughly 500 BC. This is the beginning of the period that is known in historical religious scholarship as Second Temple Judaism. And the reason why it's called that, of course, is because this is a period during which the Jews had a second temple in Jerusalem. The first temple built by Solomon had been destroyed. The Jews rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and did so roughly around 500 years before Christ. This period of Second Temple Judaism really is the first period in which we could talk about something that I think scholars would be comfortable calling Judaism, simply because it's a very different situation than prior to the exile. The key figure here at the hinge between the exile and the emergence of Second Temple Judaism would be Ezra. Ezra was a Jewish scribe, a Jewish authority in the Torah, who brought the Torah in front of the people, read it to them, exhorted them to follow the Torah, to commit themselves to to hear, listen to, and learn and obey the words of God in the Torah. Liberal scholarship today widely regards most of the Old Testament as dating from the time of Ezra and later. I don't agree with that, but everybody agrees that Ezra is a crucial figure here, whether you think that he was putting all this stuff together for the first time or simply bringing to the Jewish people and to their attention what had already been laid down in the Torah. Well, part of the picture here is that during the exile and immediately after the exile, when there is no temple, there is a shift of emphasis away from that one central location where everybody came to offer sacrifices and so forth, to a variety of locations where people would gather, but they would not gather to offer sacrifices. That's one thing the Jews were very convinced of, was that you could only offer animal sacrifices, burnt offerings and so forth in the temple. And so, since they didn't have a temple, when they gathered to worship, they would worship, but they wouldn't offer sacrifices. So what would they do? Well, they would, if they had any copies of the scriptures of the Torah, in particular, they would get together and they would read them, and somebody would comment on them, and this is the beginning of what we know as the synagogue. The synagogue is a local assembly of Jews meeting around the Torah, classically, to discuss what God had said in the Torah and how they are to live their lives in a world that does not respect the Torah. It is during this period of Persian rule that the Jews almost get annihilated again. And this is in a famous story that is recorded in the book of Esther, where a particular Persian by the name of Haman tried to get the Jews exterminated. He ended up getting himself exterminated instead. And the heroine of the story, Esther, according to the book of Esther, had convinced the king of Persia not to do this because she had been one of his concubines. Well, the Jews ever since have celebrated their deliverance from this potential disaster in an annual festival known as Purim. Purim is not generally regarded as one of the most important of Jewish holy days, but it is one that is on the calendar, if you will, and that's the historical origins of Purim. Now, the Persians didn't maintain control for very long either. These powers just came and went like crazy. And in the 4th century BC, that is the 300s BC, a figure came along that I'm sure you've all heard of, and that was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered practically the entire known world. And after he died, as a young man, by the way, his empire was divided into 4 kingdoms. Now, 2 of these kingdoms were in the general vicinity of Palestine or the Promised Land or Israel, whatever you want to call it, and they fought over that land and swapped it back and forth. One would have it, the other would take it away, and then the other would take it away from them, and back and forth they did this for, a couple hundred years. Well, one of the kings of these, one of these Greek kings, these were Hellenistic kings or Greek kings, that was ruling the Israelite people or the Jewish land in the 2nd century BC, thought it would be really cool to institute pagan sacrifices in the Jerusalem temple. When this happened, some of the Jewish men said, enough is enough. And led by a family known as the Maccabees, they revolted against the Greek king. They kicked the Greeks out, and establish Jewish independence in the middle of the 2nd century BC. Very dramatic story. And one of the elements of the story that is remembered to this day is that after they kicked the Greeks out and rededicated the temple, they noticed that something strange had happened. There was a lamp that was burning in the temple that burned for 8 days straight, if I'm remembering my story correctly, without the oil ever being replaced. It shouldn't have been able to burn that long, and so this was regarded as a miracle, a miraculous sign that God's presence was in the temple and that God was with the Jewish people in their efforts to establish independence against the Greeks. This particular rededication of the temple and the miracle of the lamp is celebrated every year, has been ever since then, in Judaism in the holy day known as Hanukkah. That is what Hanukkah is all about. All right, so as we're going through this history, as you can see, we're trying to put some of these features of Judaism that you may have heard of in some kind of historical context. Now, the Jews enjoyed their freedom, their independence, for not much more than about a century. In fact, not even a full century. And they were conquered, again, by the conqueror of conquerors, by Rome. The Roman Empire, and one of its famous generals, Ptolemy, conquered the Jewish people in the first century BC. So now we're less than 100 years away from the time of Jesus. The Jews had really enjoyed that taste of freedom and independence. And they were very, very mad about losing it to the Romans. And the Romans were a deliciously wicked enemy to hate. They were an extraordinarily strong military power for that time. They appeared to be completely beyond conquest. It seemed like it would be impossible, humanly speaking, that they could ever be free of Rome. And Rome bragged that it would be around for 1,000 years or longer. And it was just this impenetrable force. And the Jews hated the Romans with a passion. And some of them hated them enough that they tried to express that in violent ways by leading insurrections and forming resistance movements. Some of these became known in the 1st century AD as the Zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. His name was Simon, and he's called Simon the Zealot in one of the Gospels. The Zealots were representative of a widespread patriotic fervor among the Jewish people, that the Jews were meant by God to be an independent people, and their belief that God was going to bring another deliverer who would be the ultimate deliverer, and he would have to be, from their perspective, to deal with the Romans. This deliverer was to be the Messiah. They believed this Messiah would be a David-like figure, a military, heroic figure who would conquer the Romans, wipe them off the face of the earth, and establish Jerusalem as the capital city of the world, and bring the knowledge of the true God, of the Lord God, to all the nations. In the 1st century AD, this Jewish patriotic movement to resist Roman rule led to many people feeling that the best thing to do to bring about the Messiah was to begin to act like you expected him any day now. And so they would actually take up arms and start little revolts, hoping that the Messiah would show up and lead them to victory. And there were a number of these. But the most cataclysmic one took place about 40 years after Jesus was crucified. And so again, just to put these things in perspective, Jesus comes along during this period of national fervor and patriotism and unhappiness about Roman rule and the desire to see the Messiah show up. And so when Jesus shows up and is recognized by some people anyway to be the Messiah, there's a lot of concerns being expressed by Romans about him, by Jews who were in power at the time about him, and so forth. So that's kind of the historical context in which Jesus shows up. Excuse me. So about less than 40 years after Jesus was crucified, there was a big revolt and a war between the Jews and the Romans. There really wasn't any question, humanly speaking, who was going to win. The Romans crushed the Jews. They crushed the revolt. They destroyed the temple again. In AD 70, they destroyed the temple. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 really marks the end of an era for Judaism. Of course, it obviously marks the end of what we call Second Temple Judaism. We then find, beginning in AD 70, and really it takes a few decades before you have anything coherent emerging. So beginning around the beginning of the 2nd century BC, you have the emergence gradually of what can be called classical Judaism. Classical Judaism looks very different again from a lot of what passed for Judaism before AD 70. For one thing, the temple having been destroyed, those forms of Judaism that were focused on the temple obviously went by the wayside. One of the major parties in the Jewish religious establishment during the time of Jesus was the Sadducees. The Sadducees had a lot of power in the 1st century, largely because the temple had become so much bigger and more important as a result of the building projects of Herod the Great. Herod the Great thought he would ingratiate himself to the Jewish people by trying to make the temple even better than the Temple of Solomon. And there was a great deal of money and manpower and political capital put into the temple. And as a result, the people that ran the temple, and those were largely, of course, the priestly group, the priestly caste, and the high priest's family, had a lot of power and wealth and prestige in 1st century Judaism. Well, the party that was dominating the priestly temple caste were the Sadducees. Once the temple was destroyed, bye-bye Sadducees. What got left behind in Judaism was the Torah-centered form of Judaism, which is classically known as rabbinical Judaism. Of course, rabbinical is simply an adjective based on the word rabbi. Rabbi is a term that is used for a Jewish teacher of the Torah, a Jewish teacher of the law of God. The rabbinical Judaism that emerges in the 2nd century BC and thereafter is not content simply to repeat what's in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. Of course, by this time, the Jewish Bible is complete. The canon of Scripture is very much set. Historians debate when it became set, but all of the Jewish writings that are in the Jewish Scriptures, or Jewish Bible, date from well before the time of Christ. And we can just leave it at that. Those books became the foundation of Judaism, but not the entire body of authoritative material or authoritative literature. Because over the next several hundred years after the destruction of the temple and the emergence of rabbinical Judaism, you had collections of the rabbis' sayings, commentaries, and debates about the meaning of the Torah that were put together in various collections, and the most important of these were known as the Talmud. There's actually two forms of the Talmud. One was known as the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, and the other is known as the Babylonian Talmud. Well, these two collections both are more or less complete, roughly speaking, around 500 years after Christ, about AD 500. It is the Talmud, and again, there are these two sort of editions of the Talmud. It is the Talmud that becomes the authoritative texts of Judaism, classically speaking. Rabbis would study the Talmud because it was in the Talmud that you would find authoritative exposition, interpretation of the Torah. It's not that the rest of the Old Testament or Jewish Bible wasn't particularly important, but the crucial element, the crucial component of the Jewish Bible was the Torah, and the comment and interpretation on that in the Talmud became the authoritative body of literature that Jews studied, Jewish men studied, and especially the rabbis would study in order to master the teachings of Judaism. Now, it is after the emergence of Talmudic Judaism, as we might call it, the flowering of rabbinical Judaism, that the Jews run into their worst nightmare, perhaps even more so in some ways than the Romans. And that is the Islamic threat. Islam emerges in the 7th century A.D., almost exactly 600 years after Christ. And Islam started off as a movement that was more Jewish than anything else. It was more Jewish than Christian. It was more Jewish than pagan. But Islam took a turn when the Jewish people, especially those Jewish people in and around Medina, where Muhammad was based at the time, rejected Muhammad as a prophet of God. Muhammad turned his back on the Jews, not just figuratively but literally, instructing the Muslims from that point on that instead of facing north toward Jerusalem when they prayed, they would face south toward Mecca when they prayed, and to this day Muslims face Mecca wherever they happen to be when they pray. Well, this was the beginning of the tensions between the Jews and the Muslims that have gone on, of course, right up until today. Now, at times, the Jews and the Muslims got along better than the Jews and Christians. And I have to say, we'll talk about this more next week, but I have to say that during this period of classical Judaism and into the medieval era, and of course continuing right into the 20th century, there is a long history of anti-Semitism from within Christianity. And of course this shapes Judaism in a reactionary fashion, such that the Jews found it to be extremely important to their self-preservation and their identity as a people to assert the truth of Judaism over against Christianity. And so you have an intellectual, cultural conflict between Judaism and Christianity that emerges during this period. Perhaps the greatest philosopher, intellectual of Jewish history was a medieval philosopher by the name of Moses Maimonides. Maimonides was living around 1200 A.D., and he died around 1200 A.D., and Maimonides kind of put everything together for the Jews in terms of what it was that they believed, and drawing on the Talmud, both in the Jerusalem and in the Babylonian editions, and drawing on the Torah and reflecting on the debates that the Jews were having with Christians and Muslims, Maimonides formulated 13 principles of faith, which turned out to be a kind of creed that expresses, even to this day, the position of Orthodox Judaism. These 13 principles included such ideas as God is one and is in no sense a physical being. You can see that from a Jewish perspective, this leaves out the Trinity and it leaves out the Incarnation. According to the 13 principles of faith, Moses was the greatest prophet of all time, and there will never be another prophet greater than Moses. So that leaves out Jesus, of course, and that leaves out Muhammad. Maimonides' 13 principles also affirm that God had used Moses to give the Jewish people the Torah, both in its written and oral form, and therefore the oral Torah, which is preserved in the Talmud, is authoritative for Judaism. And Maimonides affirmed that the Messiah was going to come at some point in the future, obviously repudiating the idea that Jesus was the Messiah, but arguing instead that the Messiah was yet to come, but that he would come when it was God's time to send him. Now that is a basic summary of what Orthodox Judaism believes to this day. That is basic Orthodox Judaism. Now, toward the end of the medieval era in Western history, Western civilization, after Maimonides, there's a kind of reaction, partly against Maimonides, against the very dogmatic, very intellectually constructed, formal, systematized doctrine of Judaism that Maimonides represents. There's a kind of reaction against that. For those for whom religion is really more a matter of spirituality, it's more a matter of spiritual experiences than a matter of belief and doctrine. And so you have the development of various mystical forms of Judaism, and the dominant one that emerges during this late medieval era is known as Kabbalah. Now, I could spell Kabbalah for you, but it's almost certainly going to be wrong or at least disputed because Kabbalah can be spelled about 8 different ways. But Kabbalah is a mystical, occultic form of Judaism that emerges around the 13th century, and the classic text of Kabbalah was known as the Zohar, and you people still study that today. Because that is regarded as kind of the Bible of Kabbalah, Kabbalic Judaism. Kabbalah actually has enjoyed something of a revival in the 20th and early 21st centuries. A lot of Hollywood personalities got enamored of Kabbalah. It is associated with the New Age movement because Kabbalah has some of the same mystical, occultic flavor that New Age movement promotes. And so there's actually been something of a resurgence of Kabbalah in the West, but it's still very much a minority tradition in Judaism. Now, we're now moving into the modern era, and Judaism in the modern era begins to look very different very quickly. A key development really takes place in Europe as anti-Semitism becomes more and more intense on the continent of Europe, and there are rising tensions between Jews and non-Jewish Europeans for a variety of reasons. And coming out of this rising feverish pitch almost of tensions and anti-Semitism is a movement that is known as Zionism. And Zionism of course, is related to the term Zion, which is a name of the city of Jerusalem. Zionism comes out in the late 19th century as an effort to persuade Europeans, excuse me, to persuade Europeans to establish a Jewish homeland for the people of Judaism, for the Jewish people, not just for people who follow Judaism as a religion, but for the Jewish people. And, of course, to establish that in Palestine. Well, unfortunately, by this time, Palestine has been, for much of the past several hundred years, dominated by one Islamic empire or another. And it's traded hands with Christian powers from time to time as well, and it remained a hot potato throughout all this history. And we could go into great detail, but we won't do that. So late 19th century, you have the emergence of Zionism, and you do find some Christian people in Europe, especially in Britain, endorsing the Zionist cause. And in fact, in 1917, British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine was really put down on paper in a government document known as the Balfour Declaration, Balfour, the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Again, this is all part of a growing tension over what to do with the Jewish people in Europe, and a lot of people very hostile to the Jews, a lot of people very favorably disposed toward the Jews, and Jews caught in the middle, as they always seem to be. And so you've got growing anti-Semitism and also growing Zionism, endorsed in some cases by Christians as well as Jews. Well, of course, all of this comes to a tragic climax under the regime of the Nazis in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. When the Jews were made the scapegoat for everything that had ever happened bad in German history, was blamed on the Jews, and an effort was made to exterminate Jews from Europe under the Nazi regime. 6 million Jews were butchered, killed, gassed, horribly killed by the Nazis, and millions of other people as well who resisted the Nazi power, but the Nazi empire. But most notably and conspicuously, 6 million Jews. This tragedy, this horrible calamity, is known in Gentile circles commonly as the Holocaust. Jews, generally speaking, don't like that term. They use a Hebrew term for calamity, which is the Hebrew term Shoah. The Shoah really was the second the second or third of three terrible calamities in Jewish history: the Babylonian exile, the destruction of the temple, and the aftermath of that in AD 70, and then the Shoah or Holocaust in the 30s and 40s. And the Shoah really is perhaps the greatest crisis of faith that the Jews had ever experienced, even greater than the Babylonian exile. Because the Shoah comes on the heels of over 100 years of cultural pounding away at the roots of both Judaism and Christianity in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a philosophical, intellectual, cultural movement that starts around 1800, roughly speaking, and questions the foundations of biblical religion. It questions creation. It questions the reliability of the Bible through biblical criticism. It questions the whole idea of one true religious faith. And so developments in science and historical study and just the cultural spirit of the times led to this philosophy of the Enlightenment that rejected biblical religion. And Jews already had begun to rethink many of these things. In the 19th century, you already have the emergence of a couple of traditions in Judaism that we'll talk about in a bit that are at least questioning some aspects of biblical religion. But then when the Shoah takes place, and you have this devastating destruction of half of the Jews in Europe, a lot of Jews reject their faith. A lot of Jews abandon belief in Judaism. And those that don't, many of them abandon the conservative Orthodox, I should call it the Orthodox, traditional understanding of Judaism and try to accommodate their belief in God, if they even have one, to the fact that it would seem that God had abandoned them. And so you have, in the post-Shoah era, the emergence of Jews like Rabbi Harold Kushner. Rabbi Kushner wrote one of the most popular religious books of the 20th century called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Rabbi Kushner's basic message in When Bad Things Happen to Good People is that the reason why God doesn't stop these bad things from happening is that he can't. God's a very nice God. He's a very loving God. He's sweet as could be. He means only good, but he's not all powerful. You know, he's got a huge universe to run. It's very hard. If you tried it, you would find it very difficult. So don't criticize God because he's doing the best he can, all right? And if you think about God as somebody who would really love to help and love to intervene but can't, and just wants us to, realize that it's up to us, then we won't blame God, and we can still believe in him. Now, of course, this isn't the God of Moses. This isn't the God of the Exodus. It's not the God of the restoration of the Jews from the exile. It's not the God of the Bible. But it is a God that many Jews today feel that they can live with, because at least it gets God off the hook of having been bad. Because if God could have stopped the Shoah but didn't, he must be bad. And so this is how many Jews think about it. And if you want to share your belief in God and in Christ, of course, with someone who is Jewish, you need to be aware that this issue of the Shoah overshadows an awful lot in Judaism today. Well, of course, immediately after the Nazis were defeated and World War II was brought to an end, the British and Americans, but especially the British, moved quickly to establish the State of Israel in Palestine as a homeland for the Jewish people. Millions of Jews did flock to Israel. Millions of them had already, however, moved to the United States because they could be safe there, relatively speaking. There is anti-Semitism in the history of the United States, but nothing like what went on in Europe. And so you have the Jews basically in the second half of the 20th century congregating primarily in two places in the world, Israel and New York City, as a matter of fact. And really we could say the third place would be Los Angeles, Southern California. And if you want to know where most of the Jews are found in the world, they would be around the three major cities of Jerusalem, New York, and Los Angeles. Well, Jews in the United States, and of course throughout the West, have been enormously influential in Western culture, in modern society. There are only about 15 million Jews worldwide, and many of them are not believing Jews. That is, they don't believe in Judaism. But they have been influenced by Jewish history, by Jewish tradition, by Jewish culture, by Jewish emphasis on education and the pursuit of one's livelihood, the Jewish values. And as a result, Jews have been enormously influential in a positive way in modern society and in contemporary society, way beyond their numbers. Probably, well, I don't think probably is right. I think without question, more so than any other ethnic group or any other community or subgroup of people, in terms of their numbers, their influence is all out of proportion. I only have to name a few individuals from 20th century Jewish history to illustrate my point. In some cases, I only have to say their name, and you'll know. Einstein, Freud, Karl Marx. It's 19th century, but can you imagine the 20th century without the influence of Karl Marx? The whole history of the world would look different in the 20th century without Karl Marx. On a lighter side, Louis B. Mayer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM fame. And Mayer can stand for innumerable Jewish individuals in the arts, in Hollywood, in television, who contributed enormously to our culture. Again, take them out, and it doesn't look anything like the same. I mean, if you want somebody more recent than Mayer, think of Steven Spielberg, who was also Jewish. Going in some other directions here, Betty Friedan, the founder of the National Organization for Women, the architect of modern feminism, Jewish. Leonard Bernstein, one of the most influential and significant composers, conductors of the second half of the 20th century, Jewish. Henry Kissinger, one of the chief architects of modern American political theory, really, Jewish. And we could go on and on. The influence of Jews in America, the influence of Jews in the world, far, far out of all proportion, and largely a positive influence. I mean, one could argue that some of these individuals contributed in some negative ways, and that's, I mean, exactly what you would expect from a people that has just excelled everywhere you can look, in the sciences, in the arts, in politics, in business. I mean, everything you can imagine, Jews have been enormously influential. And so you really we can't even really imagine the contemporary world without the contributions of Jews. And again, I would say largely a very positive contribution. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about the major divisions or groups within Judaism, and then if we have a little bit of time, we'll open it up for some questions. I'm going to start with Hasidic Judaism, which is the smallest of these, but is worth noting. Hasidic Judaism, and I will spell that, it's Hasidic. Hasidic Judaism is a tradition within Judaism that comes around in the 1700s. Hasidic Judaism is a kind of pietistic Judaism, mystical in some ways, but the dominant trend in Hasidic Judaism was a very pietistic one, of emphasizing the idea of a personal relationship with God, personal, intimate communion with God, really getting as close to God as you could. Hasidic Judaism developed into thinking along the lines of more of a kind of panentheism, where God and the world are in a kind of symbiotic relationship, but nevertheless paralleling in some ways Christian pietism, which emphasized a personal relationship with Jesus over everything else. Hasidic Jews were almost exterminated in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. They have enjoyed something of a revival. Martin Buber, B-U-B-E-R, was an extremely influential Hasidic Jewish scholar who helped to bring Hasidic Judaism to the attention of a lot of people in the second half of the 20th century. But there's less than 1 million Hasidic Jews worldwide. Now, I mentioned that in the 19th century, a couple of alternative strains of Judaism emerged as a result of their reaction to the Enlightenment. Science, biblical criticism, etc., questioning the very foundations of Judaism. And there are two reactions that many Jews had to these challenges. And one crystallized into a stream of Judaism that is known as Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is known in Britain as liberal Judaism, and liberal is an accurate term for it. Reform Judaism basically said we can no longer maintain the traditional beliefs of Judaism. We're going to have to reinterpret Judaism if we're going to be modern people. Judaism, as classically understood, is a bunch of myths and legends. The Bible is full of them. Miracles don't really happen, or at least if they do, there's no way to know it. We're not even sure, many Reformed Jews say, we're not even sure if there is a God, or at least that kind of a God. Certainly, probably not, almost certainly not that kind of a God. And so Reform Judaism is a liberal movement in Judaism that retains the name of Judaism, but abandons most or all of what Judaism classically teaches. Over a third of American Jews are Reform Jews. Now, the other stream of alternate Judaism that emerges in the late 19th century is called conservative Judaism. Now, this is confusing because it is not conservative in the sense of holding on to traditional Judaism in all respects. That would be Orthodox Judaism. But conservative Judaism is called that because it attempted to be somewhat conservative in comparison to the Reform Judaism. So if it helps, think of conservative Judaism as a moderate Judaism. Conservative Jews emphasize the importance of Israel as a state. They're very strong on that. All Jews need to study Hebrew. They need to believe in God. They need to have these basic elements of Jewish culture and Jewish religion. But you don't have to take the Bible literally, okay? Some things may not be exactly the way they were written. That's okay. So conservative Judaism is a kind of moderate Judaism that tries to find peace with the Enlightenment without giving up Judaism at its core. Now, Orthodox Judaism, with a capital O, is the Judaism that says we're going to keep believing exactly what we've believed for the last thousands of years with no difference. We reject the Enlightenment project. We reject modern biblical criticism. We reject evolutionary science. You almost never hear this term used, but basically you could call these fundamentalist Jews, okay? They are Orthodox Jews. They are the real conservatives who are really believing exactly what Jews have always believed, or at least for the past 1900 years since the end of Temple Judaism. They emphasize strict adherence to the Talmud. observance of the Sabbath laws, all of these things are extremely important to Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews pay close attention to such things as whether you can have your lights on in the house on the Sabbath, or if that's doing work, and all these things are taken very seriously because Orthodox Jews are strict followers of the Talmud and all the rules that are in that. Now, only about 5 or 6% of American Jews are Orthodox Jews. About a third of American Jews are conservative. More than a third are Reform, and then there's a lot of Jews who aren't anything. They don't practice at all. So that gives you kind of a sense of the overview of Judaism. We've got a little bit of time here for questions, and so I'm going to relinquish the microphone. Carrie, if you're still with us here, I'll let you or whoever is supposed to be doing this take over the microphone, and those of you who are here who would like to ask questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can.
Samson felt that the modern forms of Judaism seemed almost devoid of content. He said that it seems now as if it's more of an ethnic trait rather than a set of beliefs. And he said if that is actually the case, then how does one trace back their ancestry to see if they are in fact Jewish? Here's how Rob replied.
Well, Samson, the liberal or Reform Jewish tradition certainly is devoid of any mandatory or expected doctrinal content or even religious practice that is expected of everybody. They are practically Jews in name only or Jews in culture only. Now, as far as tracing their ethnicity, Jews tend to keep track of these things, and they don't need a lot of help to remember whether their mother was Jewish. But that's basically how it's done. That's the traditional way that it's done. But in any case, there are, of course, converts to Judaism. These converts to Judaism don't necessarily convert to Orthodox Judaism. They typically don't, but some do. And so, yes, we have a situation where the term Jew today can mean someone who is Jewish ethnically, because they trace their heritage, their lineage, their physical lineage back to Jewish people. You have people who are Jewish religiously, because they embrace one or another form of the religion known as Judaism. And, of course, there are people that fit both those categories. Most people who are Jewish religiously are also Jewish ethnically, but not quite all of them. Sammy Davis Jr. would be an easy example of someone who is, at least from all appearances, obviously not ethnically Jewish, but he converted to Judaism as a religion. So that does happen. So that's basically what you're looking at. And yes, liberal Reform Judaism, you don't have to believe much of anything. In fact, you really don't have to believe anything. But they are committed to preserving, their consciousness as a Jewish people. Largely, it has to do with, at that point, with ethnic cultural history and not with religious belief.
Samson followed up by asking, what about the different groups from the past within Judaism? If they still claim to be Jewish, does that in fact make them Jewish? He gave the examples of Samaritans or Assyrians. Here's how Rob answered.
Well, again, Jewish is a narrower term than Israelite. The Samaritans regard themselves as Israelites, but they would definitely not regard themselves as Jewish, because Jewish means of the people of Judah or Judea, the tribe of Judah and the religion that emanated from Judea in Jerusalem. And so the Samaritans, who represent a religious tradition that comes out of the northern kingdom, the Israelite northern kingdom, more or less. I mean, there's a lot of debate about this, but just generally speaking, that's the usual source identification for Samaritanism, is centered on a mountain in Samaria, Mount Sychar. It has a different edition of the Pentateuch. It does not agree theologically in some minor details with Judaism, and it really represents a whole other thing, a whole other tradition. The Samaritan religion, of course, is extremely minute. All of the Samaritans in the world, as far as I know, are located in that region, and there aren't very many of them. So that's really what you're talking about with the Samaritans. But basically, anybody who calls himself Jewish would probably be qualified as one, because very few people want to identify themselves as Jewish who don't have a reason to do so, whether it's religious conversion or cultural, ethnic tradition. All right. Well, I'd like to ask those of you who are with us here today, I'd like to ask you a favor, and that is I'd like to ask you to pass the word on to people about this class. I think that a lot of people might be interested in it who don't even know about it. I bet a lot of you are on Facebook. I bet a lot of you have friends on Facebook that are not my friends on Facebook. So perhaps you could just say something on Facebook about this class, let people know that they can come into the Pal Talk room at no charge if they'd just like to drop by and listen for a while. Of course, if they want to sign up for the course and do the whole thing, they can do that as well. But if you wouldn't mind, spread the word a little bit about this class, because there's a lot of people, I think, that might benefit from it who are not aware of it. So thank you for letting me ask you to do that, and look forward to spending some time with you next week. If you didn't get a copy of the syllabus, get a copy of it from Carrie, and look forward to spending time with you guys next week.